Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Meaning, may the peace and blessings be upon you from Allah for those who don't know the meaning of our Islamic greeting. I wanted to start my conversation about men who beat their wives and how to behave with bad housewives according to Quran. I wanted you to ask yourself a question. What makes you do such a horrible act by beating your wife? You supposed to protect her from harm, but instead you are doing the opposite. Instead of loving her, you curse her and beat until there are marks all over her body. Are you not ashamed of yourself? And when she decides to leave, you cry, "Oh, please come back, please, I love you." You're a coward, but you are too foolish to accept it. Just like some people say, no matter how much you recite Quran to a donkey, he won't be able to understand it. Reading Quran and doing the opposite will get you in even more trouble in the qabr, on Judgment Day, and finally when you are tortured in hell. Unless you don't understand Arabic, then you need to make a move to read its translation in your language. While you are not reading the translation and not knowing what it says to you, you can't point the Quran that it's a book of violence when you don't know Arabic. Please start learning Arabic to understand its true meaning, and if you can't, then please read it on your language, and that totally for free. This is the nature of a human, that if something is free, it would look like it's worthless unless you try to find out. I will clearly mention to you what the Quran teaches you and how to handle a bad housewife if that is the case. No, hitting or physically abusing one's spouse is not allowed in Islam. The Quran states in Surah Nisa, men are the protectors and maintainers of women, because Allah has given the one more strength than the other, and because they spend from their wealth to support them. Therefore, the righteous women are devoutly obedient and guard in the husband's absence what Allah has guarded. As for those wives from whom you fear arrogance, admonish them first, next, refuse to share their beds, and last, beat them lightly. But if they return to obedience, seek not against them means of annoyance. Surah Nisa 4:34. It is important to note that this verse is talking about a situation where the wife is disobedient and arrogant and has not responded to admonishment or other forms of communication. Hitting or physically abusing a spouse is never acceptable under any circumstances and is a serious violation of Islamic teachings. Furthermore, Dr. Jonathan Brown will explain you about the same subject. Thank you for your time.
That's how we interact with each other in language. But when you have a text like the Quran that is always read through the Sunnah of the Prophet, you have to look at what the Sunnah of the Prophet is telling you to understand the intended meaning of the text. And in that case, the intended meaning of God's words is not necessarily the one that's closest to the evident meaning. It is the one that is best supported by the evidence of the other verses of the Quran, of the Sunnah of the Prophet, of our understanding of the overall teachings of Islam. This is what tells us the intended meaning of the Quran. And so when we read that verse that I mentioned, the verse 434, the quote-unquote wife-beating verse, when you read that, you don't read it through what comes to your mind first. You read it what comes to your mind after you understand the Sunnah of the Prophet. And the Sunnah of the Prophet on this issue is very clear. What does Aisha say in Sahih Hadith? She says, the Prophet ma daraba ahadan qat. The Prophet never struck anybody biyadihi, never struck anybody with his hand, except, not a man, not a woman, not a servant, except in the path of jihad. Never struck anybody. And when this verse is revealed that I read to you about adribuhunna, the context in which it's revealed, according to Hadith and Sunan Tirmidhi and other books, is that a woman comes to the Prophet and complains about her husband striking her. And the Prophet says, لا تضربوا إماء الله. Do not strike the female servants of God. And then Omar comes to the Prophet, depending on the version of the hadith, comes to the Prophet and says, the women in Medina are not, they're very, they're kind of overcoming their husbands. They're very forceful in their personalities. They're not like the women in Mecca. And so then then this verse is revealed and talks about how that if your wife is having nushuz, first you admonish her. If she does not desist, then you cease sleeping with her. She still continues, then the verse says you strike her. But what does the Prophet say about this? He said, لَيْسَ أُولَٰئِكَ خِيَارُكُمْ. Those people who strike their wives are not the best of you. In another version of the hadith in the Mustadrak of Al-Hakim and Naysaburi, he says, خِيَارُكُمْ لَن تَضْرِبُوا. The best of you will not strike your wives. And in Sahih Bukhari, the Prophet says, alayhi salatu wasalam, لا يجلد أحدكم امرأته جلد العبد ثم يجامعها آخر النهار أو آخر اليوم. Let none of you strike his wife like he'd strike a slave and then go and sleep with her at the end of the day. And in his final sermon, his final khutbah at Hajj, what is one of the things the Prophet says? He says, "Attaqullah fi nisaikum." Fear God as concerns your wives, because you have taken them as a trust from God. They're in your trust. And he says, only if they do commit what he says is a fahisha mubayyina, an egregious, inappropriate behavior, egregious fahisha. Then strike them, but what? Only strike them darb ghayr mubarrih, in a way that leaves no mark, that causes no harm. So that's the sunnah of the Prophet that we have to, that through which we read this verse, and through which every Islamic school of thought would read this verse. Which is why in the various schools of law, and you now, a lot of you are students here, you know how complicated fiqh is. You know how many different opinions, like for example in the Hanafi madhab you can have, Zahir Riwaya, and you have the opinion of Imam Abi Hanifa, you have the opinion of Abu Yusuf, you have the opinion of Muhammad bin Hassan Shibani, you have the opinion of Zufar bin Hudayl. You have all these opinions. So fiqh is very complicated. But across the different madhabs, there's the same theme over and over again. You can only strike your wife lightly, in a way that causes no harm. If you cause her harm, you're liable for the diya, you're liable for compensating her for injuries. And according to every school except the Hanafi school, a judge, if a wife goes to a judge and says, my husband's beating me, and there's witnesses or evidence that the husband's beating her, or the husband confesses, the judge can do what's called tafriq. He can end the marriage legally, and the wife will get to keep her mahr, and the husband has to pay her nafaqah until her iddah ends, and the marriage is over. And this is what I found very interesting in my research, that if you look at Sharia court information about Sharia courts, whether it's in Iran in the 900s, or Andalusia in the 900s, or Syria in the 1300s, or Janneh in Mali in the 1900s, or Zanzibar in the 1900s, or Yemen in the mid-20th century, or Egypt in the 1920s, you always see the same thing. Husband or wife goes to the court, says, my husband's beating me. If there's evidence that he's beating her, like physically, if there's witnesses, if the husband confesses, judge would end the marriage. If the woman wants, she'll end the marriage. She keeps her dowry. She gets maintenance. And the husband, if there's injury, has to pay to compensate the injury. And this is, for example, in the Hanafi realm of Palestine in the 17th century. There's one case where a woman has some of her teeth knocked out by her husband, and the judge says, you have to pay, husband, you have to pay your wife 3 gold coins because this is the diya for teeth. And so it's very interesting because in the tradition of American law and British law, it's only in the very late 19th century or in the 20th century that a husband can ever have to pay any money to his wife. Before then, married women aren't allowed to own property. And there's something called in law tort immunity, where the husband's actually immune from any case that his wife brings against him that he harmed her. It's impossible for him to be liable financially to her. But in the Islamic tradition, since the very beginning, since the life of the Prophet ﷺ, part of the Sharia was that just because you're married to somebody doesn't mean that if you injure them, you don't have to pay for it. You can't be held accountable before the law. You're always held accountable. In the Sharia, if you harm anybody, you're held accountable. Doesn't matter if they're your wife or your husband.
Thank you for watching the video, and I hope you found it informative. If you would like to stay updated on our future content, please consider subscribing to our channel and activating the notification bell. Additionally, if you do not have a physical copy of the Quran, I would like to recommend visiting our website, www.memorizealiquran.com, to download your free ebook. In our upcoming videos, we will be discussing important topics such as racism, child abuse, and other prohibited acts in Islam. And we will make translation about such videos in 44 languages. We also plan to create translation videos of the Quran in 44 different languages, so please stay tuned for those as well. Your support is greatly appreciated, and I wish you all peace, mercy, and blessings. Sincerely, Diamond Club 2023.